Okay, I think we will start now. So just do a quick round of introductions before we go into the presentation today. So my name is Aaron Perrott. I'm the CTO at KTSL. Been in the service management industry for just over 25 years in different types of roles, and I'm responsible for the technology roadmap at KTSL and our technology planning and IP that we do internally. Also with me today is Andrew Davies. He is our senior business analyst here at KTSL, and he's going to do the bulk of the talking today around the ITIL areas of the subject matter we're going to discuss. And we also have Afshan with us from our partners at Cyberchain Alliance. Afshan can cover off any more detailed questions around CISO or around how this relates more to the security area. We are going to allow questions in the chat as we go. We will try to get to them as we go along. So myself and Afshan, who, when we're not talking, we'll be monitoring that and replying as we can. If we don't get to anything, then what we'll do is we'll pick them up at the end of the session. So we'll have a little bit of time there. During the session, we do have a Q&A for people to respond to. So if you could do that, because it just helps us tailor the presentation a little bit if we understand the audience that we're pitching to, and therefore we can make sure we extend it where we need to. So the subject today is ITIL and information security management. And really what we're going to talk about is how the two can come together. So in many organizations, security management and the ITSM are kept quite separate. But in reality, they can dovetail quite neatly together. And there's a huge amounts of benefit to be had to have them linked up. And what we're going to talk about today is how they could be linked, some of the benefits you might see and some of the challenges that can solve. We're going to do a quick introduction. Then we're going to cover just a brief high view around how ITIL can fit in to this process. Then talk a little bit about ISO 27000 and what that means. We're then going to move into covering governance as one of the practices within ITIL. Then we're going to talk about some of the challenges, and then we're going to run through each of the other practices within the ITIL disciplines and how they relate back to InfoSec, which, as you can see, is what we'll end on. So we'll summarize that at the end. And as we said, any questions, please put them in the chat as we go, but we'll also take some questions additionally at the end as well. So let's start with the introduction. So first of all, where is the overlap? Well, the objective of ITSM is controlling the activities around the IT service. So whether that's incident, change, problem, request, but effectively everything that happens or from IT or is required by users of IT. So this could be around the design, the build, the delivering, the operations, or the IT that customers as well as internal users require. And that's typically split across 4 dimensions. So the people you require, the IT itself, the partners and suppliers that are involved, and how those value streams and processes dovetail in to provide the value. Because what ITIL is focused on is around making sure ITSM delivers value to the business and to your customers in a streamlined and efficient way. And then if we look at the objective of information security, well, that's about putting controls in place to ensure that confidential information, we protect any vulnerabilities, we have full integration of our assets, and we make sure that they are protected from any external threats. And many organizations have these procedures in and around InfoSec and typically might manage them within an information security system. But if you look again at the 3 pillars of InfoSec, so you have people, you have process, and you have technology. And you can quickly see how there's a neat dovetail between those two. And many of the processes that exist within ITIL and within ITSM can fit quite neatly into InfoSec and vice versa. For example, if I have a security threat or a security incident, for example, that's going to fall straight into my process or maybe my incident process. But there's a huge overlap between the two. And as technology has evolved and the cyber threat has increased, this combining of those two things has got bigger and bigger. So hence the conversation today, and we're going to talk about how we can leverage best practices in both areas to provide a more efficient single process. So I think we're going to do a quick poll. So Andrew, do you want to pick up the information behind the poll?
Charlotte, are you setting off the poll now yet?
Yep, there we go. Should be on.
So we just want to find out for the people that are on the call today where your knowledge sits within ITIL and security. So we've got 4 areas of the poll. So if you click the one that best applies to you, and then we can have a look at to see what our audience spread is today. Okay, so looks as if we've got spread across 2. So people that are familiar with ITIL is just under 40%, and then people that are knowledgeable on both are just under 40%. And then we've got a couple of entries in the other 2 slots. So it looks like a fair spread across both, maybe with a slight leaning towards people understanding ITIL more than the security side. Which has just happened as we've had another response. Okay, thank you very much for that, because that gives us a good idea in terms of who we've got on the call and how we can make sure we pitch it appropriately. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, just to run through some of the ITIL steps. So over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you see the slide?
We can.
Thank you. So a quick recap on ITIL. We're up to ITIL 4 now, and they're no longer called processes, they're called practices, because they incorporate the process and the people and the technology and the suppliers. There are 17 for the traditional service management ones, the ones in kind of yellow. There's another 14 that are general practices. So risk management and project management are general management practices covered now by ITIL 4, and there are 3 technical practices. And you string these together into value streams, but that's an ITIL course. So there's 34 of them. I'm going to try and cover most of these today, and we'll dip into some challenges as we go. So we're going to have to move quite quickly. So I'm not going into depth, but I've grouped them into these little groupings just to make it easier to go through them all, and we'll try and cover them all. Just a word about the ISO 27000 series. So this is a series of documents for best practice in security from the ISO people. It's a standard. The main one people focus on is 27001, which is the controls. And if you wanted your organization to be certified, these are the controls you would be audited against. And about 45,000 companies each year go through this. But there are lots of other documents in this series giving guidance and best practice. If we dive straight into governance. So the processes here, the first one I'm covering is continual improvement. This is a key ITIL process. And what this process aims to do is to foster ongoing improvement. And it does that through this mechanism at the bottom here. And you might put in a system where you track things you want to improve, track how you're progressing, and report on it. If we were to look at ISO 27001, that also calls for you to do continual improvement. So already you're seeing how much there is overlap and how much, if you were practicing this ITIL process, you'd be also immediately delivering on some of your security objectives. In fact, Annex B in the ISO document says use the plan, do, check, act approach from Edwards Deming, and the ITIL one is based on the PDCA as well. So that's continual improvement. If we take these 3 processes, so people are familiar with service level management and service level agreements. They're about setting expectations. But the business, if it's got any sense, will also want to know that its IT function is also providing it with the right level of security. So as well as communicating to the business or your customers what you're doing in terms of service, the SLA, the SLM should be communicating what your objectives and what you're achieving in terms of security. Relationship management, as part of the relationship with your business or your customers, you might need to discuss their obligations, you might need to agree downtime, and you might need to tell them the consequences. So as well as looking at the service, that's an opportunity to also look at the security aspects. A big weakness in a lot of companies is the supplier management. I guess you're only as secure as your weakest supplier. And this is where, based on the contract, but supplier management, you would make sure that they're tight as well. There's a really good example here of Fazio Mechanical Services, who in 2013 was subject to a phishing attack. A number of accounts were compromised. One of Fazio's biggest customers was the American supermarket Target, and the hackers got the credentials for the Target servers. From there, they deployed some malware onto the point of sales terminals and stole the credit cards and personal details of estimated 40 million people. So, you know, Target was doing most things right, but not managing this supplier who were weak. If we get time at the end, I'll talk about the casino hack. It's amusing. Measurement and reporting. So the ITIL framework tells you how to go about this, about what measures you need, how you set them, how you report them. So from a InfoSec point of view, you want to obviously report what you're doing and your successes. So really, this should all sweep up into one common set of activities. I'll just briefly hand over to Aaron back again so he can run through some challenges. I'll move to the next slide.
Yeah, so what I want to talk about is some of the challenges that sit within information security. So obviously our security systems become more vital as we move through each year. And comprehensive standards and certifications are often commonplace, so whether that's ISO or Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, there's different information security standards that we need to adhere to. The key challenges quite often with these, though, are implementing them or maintaining them, but also having a continuous improvement loop to make sure they stay at the right level. And this often needs to dovetail into things like DevOps, new releases, because your IT landscape is constantly evolving and you need to make sure that you're staying on top of that from an InfoSec level as well as purely a delivery level. So some of the typical high-level challenges we often see are around implementation. So making sure that you've got stakeholder buy-in for the security aspects as well as just putting the shiny new thing live, because you need to make sure that you've got those controls in place. So whether that's making sure that your asset management is up to date, you're doing appropriate risk assessments, your communication relationship management is good, how you're managing suppliers, as Andrew's alluded to, or how your change is run, because you want to make sure that you have the right level. You don't want to stymie development within the business because it's important for the business ultimately to be successful. But equally, you need to have the right level of controls because, as Andrew's alluded to, any sort of breach can be very bad for the business. It can have a negative impact on your customers. So you need to make sure that you have the right balance when looking at any level of implementation. And that leads neatly into governance and maintenance. You need to make sure as that evolution happens, you're staying on top of that you're both on top of anything that's coming from an external threat, but also things that are happening internally. And that level of governance should address that changing landscape and feed into the stakeholders that are managing that area of the business. We need to have continual improvement. So just like we have that within the ITSM landscape, we need that in the InfoSec landscape. So we should have better ways of responding to security threats and vulnerabilities, use automation where we can, make sure we've got good event management to tell us what's happening. And that's corresponding to a good CMDB to make sure we understand the impact of those events. And then good training and comms to everybody that works within the business. Make sure our training is up to date. Make sure our staff understand what to look for so we can stay on top of these events before they happen. And then finally, we have response actions. So when something does happen, we need to make sure that whether that's preventative monitoring or whether that's a ticket that hits particular people within a queue, it gets dealt with quickly and efficiently to make sure that we minimize any impact to the business, and making sure that any business continuity that we need to invoke can be done quickly and that IT understand how to do that. So what are some typical challenges that we might face? So we need to have good collaboration for a start off between our dev security support teams. Everything you put live focuses across those three areas, or it should. And typically in many organizations, security tends to be slightly offset from those other two. So it tends to be something that's brought in quite late potentially to the project. But if you're, for example, need to penetration test a piece of software, there's no point doing it right at the very end, because then making any changes is going to be quite difficult. It's going to delay the release. It should be a constant evolution during the development of that application, and something that can sit quite neatly alongside that. So whether it's a level of automated pen testing, or whether it's done manually, there should always be a line that sits within your DevOps to make sure that it's a constant thing that's checked. If we have a major event, can we get hold of the right people? Can we triage quickly? How is our DevOps process linked to SecOps? How do we manage those updates and those changes? Do we have security representation on change? Many organizations that we work with don't. So change management tends to be segregated away, and then security are only brought in on special changes, whereas quite often they might pick up on something quite early on within the change board that they can mitigate any longer term issue. Can we leverage those experiences, those processes to have one? So you might have a incident response process in SecOps, but you probably already have a major incident management process within ITSM and within ITIL. So it should make sense to combine them and have one process and one set of governance. And how do we treat our security incidents differently? Or should we just treat them the same? They're both incidents, they both have an impact. So therefore, there should be some consistency in that management. Proactively monitoring. Do we apply the same rules to InfoSec as we do to ITIL? Because we should. And then how do we manage our patch management? Do we automate this? Is this defined? And these are just some of the typical things we're finding when we're talking to businesses at the moment, but how we can best bring the two things together and how we can solve some of the challenges that they may have within their organization and within their business. And that leads neatly on now to looking at some of the practices in more depth around some of these areas. So I will hand back to Andrew.
Thank you, Aaron. So we start with some of the incident-y type practices. From an ITIL perspective, an incident is an unplanned interruption. From a security incident perspective, it's basically an attempt to inappropriately interfere with your information system. So relatively similar. In terms of the sources of how you identify your incident security incidents, they would both be either brought up by users, or you'd pick it up with some event monitoring, or a specialist would pick them up. So that's common. The process for then managing through those incidents, detecting, logging, classifying, are common. There are a couple of differences. So security incidents tend to be categorized differently. Security incidents, you tend to not want a lot of people to know about them. You don't want to tell lots of people that your fences are down. So those tend to be access controlled, and the incident process, the security process, is more concerned with collecting evidence as it goes, whereas under a normal service management, you would focus on just restoring the service. As Aaron mentioned, major incident, whether it's a big security issue or whether it's a service outage, you're going to want to do the same things. You're going to want to have a major incident manager coordinating. You're going to want to set up a war room where everybody's on the same call, and you're going to want to keep everyone updated on what's going on. So you need a comms function. So here's another example of where a common set of practices for both service management and SecOps. Problem management is where we look for root causes. For security management, SecOps, it's quite important that you get to the root cause of your intrusion, your breach, whatever. You need to work out what was the vulnerability, what was the weakness that was exploited. And the techniques for looking at the root cause of a service management failure and the techniques for looking at the root cause of a InfoSec issue are similar. You'd use the 5 whys and the Ishikawa diagrams and the Kepner-Trigo. So you can even use the same tools there. Monitoring an event, using automation to understand your environment. The same monitoring tools these days tend to monitor security events and service management potential issues. So that the common tool would pick up these events. You would set your thresholds and categorize them on severity based on that, and then you would then review them and turn them into incidents for investigation. So again, parallels here between doing that for security and for service. A few people-y type processes. So a key part of security is about putting lots of policies in place. The ISO standards require lots of policies, and people need to know what those policies are. So your knowledge management solution is how you can tell people where they can find those policies. You probably wouldn't store them in your knowledge management solution, but you want people to know what they need to do, what the standards are, and you would do that through articles. You can also use your knowledge management to tell them what to do in various security situations. What do I do if I get a phishing email? Knowledge articles that are easy accessible and answer their questions. Workforce management, so your HR folk need to have these lines of security. So first of all, screening. You don't want to be hiring people who are going to be a threat actor. You in their terms of conditions, those should contain all of their obligations in terms of security, what they need to do, and what would lead to disciplinary procedures. And even on termination, their contract would say, when you leave us, you need to return this, you can't take this, and then that can be enforced. So this is where that's helping your security. Organizational change management, there might be a comms team or a training team or something more, especially in big organizations. A key part of achieving your security objectives is about training your staff. They need to be aware of regulations like GDPR and personally identifiable information and what they need to do. So quite often when people join an organization, they're now put through that training. There's also usually lots of comms and telling people about phishing and telling them to be aware, and that's usually quite successful in reducing vulnerabilities. A couple of delivery processes. So availability management, there's a great deal of overlap here. From a service management perspective, you're looking to ensure that a service is performing its agreed function when required. From an InfoSec perspective, you're basically doing the same. You want it to be available when required. Information security isn't just about protecting the information. That would be easy. You'd put it in a safe and throw away the key. It needs to be accessible. So a scenario where lots of users come to, say, your sales website, it's been endorsed by someone or whatever, can look very similar to a denial of service attack, and you might actually have the same kind of controls and the same responses to respond to both. Capacity and performance management, it's again a requirement, one of the controls that these be put in place. You need to make sure you've got the right capacity for systems to achieve their business objectives, and then you're achieving both the service management objectives and your InfoSec objectives. Service continuity, formerly known as disaster recovery. A key part of this is your backup strategy. Best practice for backup is the 3-2-1 rule, that you would have 3 copies of any data. 2 of those would be on different media, and 1 of it would be off-site. InfoSec tends to bring an extra one and says that one of those copies should also be read-only. You can't overwrite it; it's immutable, and that means that if there was a ransomware attack where they tried to overwrite your data or threaten to overwrite your data, if there's a hard copy that's stored, then they just can't. So that's a slight variation there. Change, now known as change enablement in ITIL 4, formerly change control. So as Aaron mentioned, your InfoSec people should be approving the changes. The other thing about change is this is seen as, one area where uncontrolled change leads to service degradations and potential security breaches. So not only do you want this rigorous change management, you also want to prove that you've got that in place. You want to show your auditors. So instead of waiting till December and then scrabbling around for information to give to audit. Your change process should really be collecting this information and should have that idea of showing that you're doing this properly, so that it's gathered and that becomes a very easy activity that you can prove that you're validating and testing. Release management is about keeping all of your software up to date. If you take, for example, the WannaCry vulnerability, that was known about and was described on the National Vulnerability Database 2 months before the big event. So staying up to date on release management not only is good for users getting the latest software, but also is a key form of protection. Asset and config. So configuration management, as I mentioned, is quite key for your services. You want to know what their criticality is to your business. You want to know if any of them have personal information on them. And then you can see the IT components beneath that need the required action. Similarly, InfoSec is quite keen on IT asset management. You want to know where all, especially end user devices, who's got them. Devices should be linked to individuals, so you can see who's doing what. And it also means that when that individual leaves, you can recover your device. You don't want your laptops being sold on eBay afterwards. Catalog management and request management go hand in hand for most companies. Their catalog is expressed as their kind of request pages. The request itself then, if people can only get access to systems by going through the request process, not by asking their mate to set up an account, that brings a level of rigor. You can put approvals in there and have an audit trail and show what's going on. It means if you want to revoke accounts, you can do that. You've got clarity on that. You can also make these quite sophisticated, where you can track a person's current access levels and use that to determine not just if they get access to a system, but what access. It also means that with privileged access, quite good practice is to give limited time access if you want to make someone an admin. If you make the request process really slick, that's low friction, that's easy to do. And so giving someone access for a day or for a week, it isn't a big deal anymore. It's not like they have to lose a lot of time doing that. It can work very quickly. So I'll just whiz through these ones now. I think we're getting the idea. Business analysis, when we're collecting requirements, obviously you're going to be collecting your security, and that's going to be at your front of your mind. In project management, as well as maybe running a risks and issues register, you might want to at the same time run a register of security issues that you come across during the project. Software development, I think a lot of us heard of secure by design. We should be building security in. We want to deploy patches in a timely manner. So how you deploy, you don't want to really wait till an annual event. You want to keep that rolling. And when you're managing your platforms, you'll have things like segregation of duties, and those operating procedures are part of your security fabric. Strategy is the last set I'll cover. So obviously your strategy would contain a lot of strategy around information security and data protection. When you're managing your portfolio of upcoming projects, you might want to evaluate them on whether they contribute to better security or whether the project could lead to some risks. Your financial management, you might want to know what the financial impact is of any viruses or other security intrusions, and then you can report that and you can justify your efforts. Risk management is essentially what InfoSec is. It is basically a threat times a vulnerability is risk, and architecture, you should be architecting around InfoSec, of course. So hopefully I've shown you there with a quick whiz through the ITIL processes, how pretty much all of them are contributing to your information security. And if you're doing these things well, involve your security people. The IT service management cohort should be taking this as part of their job, and it doesn't need to be a separate stream. So I think that's covered everything I wanted to go through today. So I'll hand back to you, Aaron, if I may.
No worries. Thank you, Andrew. So do we have any questions that people would like to ask? If you could put them into the chat, and then we can pick them up. Or if not for right now, if you do want to contact us with any questions, then you can. We could be contacted on hello@ktsl.com, and then we'll make sure that we provide an answer, whether that's for ourselves or through our partners at Cyberchain Alliance.